Hey, podcaster. We are back here with Melissa from Wit and Wire. Now, she has a background in at Teachable, is where she started before Wit and Wire, where if you're familiar with Teachable at all, you know that they are huge into course creation. That's what they do. They're a SaaS company that helps entrepreneurs create courses and make money that way. So we're going to talk about helping that podcast get to the #2 rates on the charts, as well as what she's doing now with Wit and Wire and her takeaways from how to make a good course with Teachable and her time there as well. So, Melissa, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jace.
Awesome. Well, let's get into like your time at Teachable first, and we'll get into what makes a good course and what you're doing with Wit and Wire. And that's a tongue twister, with Wit and Wire. But how do you get involved at Teachable? Where did you start? When they brought you in? Was it with the podcast right away, or how did that come about?
Great question. It wasn't with podcasting at all. I had previously worked for General Assembly in New York, and I was teaching in-person Excel classes kind of separately from my full-time job. And then after that, I had worked full-time for a course creator named Ramit Sethi. He's a New York Times bestseller. And I was Ramit's company by Teachable. And it was a great opportunity for me because although I loved helping on the course creator team, it was really cool to be in the point of view where we were helping so many creators. And so it was fun to learn what they were doing with their courses. And when I joined Teachable, we were only 35 people. And I joined as this like ninja kind of made up job called head of special projects. This is, startup world at its finest. So I reported and just took on company projects across all kinds of departments. And then about a year and a half in, I did end up moving into became a marketing director. And while I pitched the CEO on the concept of having a podcast. And it wasn't really within the scope of my job. It was just something that I felt strongly could be beneficial for the business. And I had previously and just kind of decided to go for it. And I got right. And that's how Everything is Teachable, the podcast, came to be.
Awesome. So when you got the green light, then was it like just you heading up the project, or what kind of team did you have around you? Because that's, as we talk about kind of the growth of that podcast, I think it's important to know, what kind of resources you had leading into that.
It was probably a much smaller operation than most people would guess. I was the host. I was the producer. Although I had editing experience, I did hire an editor who I trusted to do that part of the show. But I was also the one responsible for, writing the show notes, putting them on the site, doing the marketing, writing the emails that went out to our list. And I would say, of course, the biggest two assets that Teachable had going into it were, number one, a starting audience. Mm-hmm. That can't be downplayed, right? We already had a pretty massive email list. We had a big social media following. And so I'm not here to pretend like I built that from the ground up. Mm-hmm. But we had never had a podcast. And so getting people to listen to the show and come to me. And then the other asset, which was even bigger, was our network of business owners, of course creators, because all of the guests on Teachable's podcast, with a few exceptions, are product users. And so that was a big premise of the show, is that we were interviewing people who had Teachable courses. And something that was really important to me was to keep it very diverse, not just the people, although ages, ethnicities, like all across the board, diversity was important to me, but also diversity of topic. Like, yes, you can have a course on marketing, but I wanted to show off people playing the handpan, this weird like UFO instrument, or watercolor painting, or sketching. I really wanted to show that you could make teaching just about anything.
Totally. And that's a concept that we hear a lot. Your current customers or potential customers, right? With that, like, what were some of the ways that you were able to conduct those interviews without making it seem like just a pitch for Teachable literally every episode?
I think if people tune into the podcast, they'd be surprised to hear how not salesy it is. Mm-hmm. So that was something that was important to me in the pitch to the CEO, is that I did not want it to be about Teachable. So in the beginning, of course, brought to you by Teachable. And then in the end, we had like a little outro where I shared, here's what Teachable is, here's where you can get started for free. But the bulk of the episode was really about the creator. And I think the best way to sell your product is to show that it works. And so that was really the biggest thing that I brought to the table. And when we started the podcast, it launched in 2018, I think. And at the time, pre-pandemic, yes, people knew about online business, but not to the degree that people know about it today. And so I think this concept of, selling courses online, people didn't fully get. And I saw people who had great skills, but didn't even know that this was a conceptual possibility for them. And so if I could show a mother who has her own course about raising goats on her farm and earning a full-time income doing that, I felt like that would really inspire people to see what could be possible. And that was really the pitch of the show, was to not be a big sales pitch, but instead just to say, like, here's what you can do. Here's what life can look like as a course creator, and sell people on the lifestyle instead of just selling them on the product.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how did you, I know we can't talk specific numbers, but how do you see that concept correlate then back into business for Teachable?
I can't tell you how many people cite the podcast. Like when they're joining or they talk about the product, a lot of people just talk about how useful the podcast was, or for some people, it was the first way they heard about it. Even the CEO, like investors or various people who were out, and they would comment on the podcast of all the things that Teachable was up to. That was the thing that they associated. And so I think that for a brand as big as Teachable, podcast is just yet another way to connect with people. And kind of to your point, it's hard to draw a perfect straight line to a purchase. And that's not just true for Teachable. That's true for anybody with a business. But, we had some dedicated tracking links where the CTA I used at the end of the episode was one that we only used. So I could see people were starting trials, and that had a little bit of success. But for the most part, my for the show were just to increase the of downloads and kind of have the hypothesis more downloads on the podcast would lead to more product users, or even for current product users, just affinity to the brand and continued usage of the product too.
Yeah, totally. There's, lifetime customer value is such important. And I think the more you can connect with your customer, the longer that lifetime value is going to be. And a podcast is a great way to kind of scale that connection, because it's like they're sitting in the room with you having a conversation, except they're not participating. They're just listening.
Exactly. So, and with courses too, a lot of people don't know anyone else who sells online courses. So it can feel challenging. I feel like podcasters probably feel similarly. I know when I launched my first podcast, like I didn't know anybody else in the podcasting space. So it can feel very lonely. So with Everything is Teachable with the podcast, I think it's nice to feel like, oh, you get Tila, you get to meet Danny, you get to meet these other people. And having your own online course is not something that happens overnight. Even if you do like the simplest possible approach, it does take a version and to build it out. So I think it's kind of nice to hear not just yet another tactic, yet another marketing strategy, but just real stories of real people who did this and said this was worth it.
Totally. Yeah, that's actually, I have a networking events for podcasters twice a month. And how that got started is I just posted on Facebook a few different groups like, hey, if I did in-person or virtual in-person networking events, but did anybody show up for podcasters? And I had like 300 messages overnight. I was like, yeah, people want to know other people that are in the same boat. So if you're thinking about like, who's your target customer and what can connect them, in Melissa's example, they all were course creators. Maybe you're all investing in real estate or what have you. Bringing that community around them can be so powerful. So now that you're at your own doing your own thing, CEO of Wit Wire, what did you bring from Teachable to Wit Wire that makes it the success that it is?
I think there was a lot behind the marketing of working for a very big company. In some ways is very useful because you've seen what works at scale. In other ways, you have to kind of learn how to operate as a company. Like when I started Wit Wire, it was from scratch, right? That's where we all start. And so
Yeah.
I started just as a blog really at first and as an Instagram account where I was just trying to learn more about what podcasters had questions about, putting out good content. Very fortunate position of enjoying my full-time job. So I really just kind of seized the day to not go full in on the business right from day one. But I think that those audience building, those content building months in the beginning were really helpful because you can just ask questions and learn what people need. And I think the heart of every business is that you are solving somebody's problem. So you have to figure out what is the problem, and then you have to figure out what people need to get from point A to point B. And that's the power of an online course too, because of course, a big thing I learned at Teachable was also what makes a great online course. And not just through my work as an employee, but also as somebody who taught in-person classes at General Assembly and had my own online courses previously, and then my Wit and Wire business. It's just something that really a lot of people have expertise, but what you know into a course that can help achieve the outcome that they're looking for, I think is a real challenge. And so that's something that I like talking about because I think teaching is really hard. And it's something that is a skill, just as gardening or real estate or the first skill that you had. That's a skill as well.
Totally. So it sounds like the first kind of pillar, if you will, or step of creating a great course is understanding your audience's problem. How do you go about that, or how do you suggest? What are some ways to do the research? I think of one right off the top of my head, but I'll let you go first.
Sure. So I think for all of us who are kind of in the very early stages of having our own business or sharing our knowledge online, you can play around with more than just a course. By that, I mean, maybe you do book some one-on-one clients. Maybe you do a workshop. Like there are ways that you can get paid to figure out what do people want from you. And so that is the problem. People don't want to be a podcaster. Like that's not a problem. Nobody's out there asking, how do I be a podcaster? You have to ask one question deeper. Like, why do they want? For some people, they want to have a podcast because it will help their business. It will help with visibility. It will help them sell more products and services. People, they might want to have a podcast because they enjoy it and they want to share in that with more people. And so you may start to realize that as you ask those questions, why does somebody want this? Digging deeper, you may realize that you need to get more who your customer is. So for Wit and Wire, I'm targeting online business owners, people who maybe want to be speakers, people who are trying to build authority or a brand or a business, as opposed to hobby podcasters who are wonderful, but maybe their strategies or their core desires are not exactly the same as the business owners that I serve.
Totally.
The problem that I'm solving for people is, how do I launch a podcast that lasts, that is sustainable over time, and earn money without having a huge audience? So that's the problem that I solve for people.
How did you figure that out?
Mostly by identifying pretty early on, I knew who I wanted to serve because I had been, these were like my people, fellow online business owners. So I knew that I wanted to talk with that person specifically, kind of cut through and figure out that it wasn't about being an influencer and just having like the biggest possible audience, the right kind of audience, definitely growing over time, without using the strategy of getting 10,000 downloads an episode and then and kind of going in that route. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's the right goal, but I knew for my ideal student, that wasn't quite it. So that's why I think getting really clear on that problem, it really does change what the course could turn into, because the steps that you take to get to that will be slightly different depending on who your person is.
Right. And the course, in my experience, I don't have a course, so just putting that out there. But in my experience, the courses that I either purchase or are compelled to really look into are the ones that have a very specific outcome for a very specific problem that I'm at in that stage of my business life, whatever it is that I'm purchasing the course for. Do you hold that to be true? I would imagine pretty general courses like level up your life, isn't going to perform as well as, how to raise baby goats from, 6 months to 2 years and get them to produce again,
That's exactly it. And we talked about this a lot at Teachable, but people are buying a transformation. They're buying an outcome. So I often joke, people don't necessarily want to know that they're supposed to go to the gym. They want to have a six pack. Like they want the thing at the end. And the purpose of your course is to get them there. And I think there's a big misconception that the best courses are the biggest or the most videos, they're the most content, because back in the day, and probably still currently, when I see course sales pages, a lot of people brag about that. They're like, it's 15 hours of content. And I look at that and I think, oh no, I have to watch 15 hours of content.
Yeah.
Like, that's the last thing that I want. So there is something to be said for, the bigger the transformation, probably the larger the course is or the longer to go through it. But I think something that a lot of really successful course creators do is you are deciding as much what should go in the course as you are what you don't need in the course.
Totally.
Because you want to get somebody to that outcome possible without missing anything. So I think a tangible tip, what that outcome is. So for my program, it's, past including like the first 5 episodes, you have to kind of work your way to figure out what are the milestones, what are the core skills that somebody would need to get in order to achieve that outcome. And imagine it in that way. The general courses life become really hard to map out because it's not necessarily a stepwise situation. Or even if I imagine something about Pinterest, a course about how to learn about Pinterest is not something I would purchase. But if somebody taught me how to get a number of page views a month on my site through Pinterest, this is for me. Or maybe there's a more advanced course and they say how to go from this level to that level on Pinterest. You can see how that outcome doesn't just make it more obvious to the buyer who it's for, which is great, but it'll also help you figure out what needs to go in this, what maybe doesn't quite fit.
Totally. Yeah. And the reason why courses are so valuable and why people would actually pay to do it or get them is for that specific outcome in a shorter time that it would take them to just Google the answer and figure it out on their own, right? Because there's not information out there that's not Googleable, however you want to say it. It's just in a condensed format, it's going to be more valuable because you're cutting time then as well. So how do you get people from the podcast to the course?
They're to do it, and I would encourage hosts to try different options, but you can talk about the course directly, like on your show to promote your course and to say, here's a link at this URL. But I found it works better to use or an opt-in that lets you pitch the program later. Because even if you're building relationships through your podcast week over week, people don't necessarily have a credit card out as they're tuning in. But if you have something that's valuable, like for mine, I have a free masterclass or I have a fun free quiz on my site about learning your podcast. Like if you can get people to take a first step that feels very attainable, then they'll have the time and the space to continue getting to know you.
Sure.
Now, I will say if your course is under $50, I think you can pitch it directly. I'm talking more about if your course is in and up range that you would maybe want to put some step in hand. But I think it's good to just try different options, see what people click on. And to do that, you have to use unique tracking links. This is something other guests have talked about as well. But I use for a WordPress site, there's a plugin called Pretty Links. Site, there's an inbuilt tool called URL mapping, but you create shorter speakable links, like easy to remember links, so that when people use it, then along add in tracking details so you can see this call to action from my podcast actually lead somebody.
Totally.
So I think that that's super useful because otherwise you're just kind of guessing, and I don't like to guess. I like to data.
Yeah, exactly. I tell people that when they're guesting on shows to use a unique link like witandwire.com/Jace. That'll take you to Melissa's masterclass. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But to having some sort of tracking like, hey, this effort got me this or this many visitors or, at least tracking somewhat. So then whether you are blowing up on this space or this space, and you can put more effort and dollars and time into those things. So we're getting towards the end of our time here, Melissa. So there is a free gift that Melissa is giving to the listeners that make money podcasting. It is at witandwire.com/Jace. You can go there. I'll take you right there. We just talked about how this whole thing works. But Melissa, why don't you tell them a little bit about what that is, what to expect when they land on that page?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I have a free masterclass called How to Launch a Podcast in 60 Days Without Feeling Overwhelmed. In the class, I talk a lot about how to actually launch a podcast today, as opposed to some strategies from a few years ago. And there are a lot of mistakes that I see a lot of new hosts making. So I walk through a few in the very spirit of the podcast. A lot of it is about making money, and what for very big shows of the past might not work for you as a business owner. But there's also a little bit on my podcast launch playbook and the 4 phases that I encourage hosts to go through. So if you want to get a sense of how I like to help people launch podcasts, that at witandwire.com/Jace.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Melissa, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.